guys, so I'm here with a special guest whose name...
Every single time.
You've got to have a fun way to introduce the guest.
Sure.
His name rhymes with Spaniel Towel. It's Daniel Howell!
Oh my god! I think you can just call me Dan, you know.
Hi, Dan.
We've known each other long enough.
So did you know your name rhymed with Spaniel
I
Towel?
was aware.
Was that one of your high school nicknames?
No.
Oi, Spaniel, get over here. Bring me the ball back.
People just said, nerd, come over here, I want to punch you.
Oh.
So what japes do you have planned for today, Phil?
Well, today we're getting very intellectual and we are talking about hair. Because
I mean, you know, to get to psychology and stuff, I'm sure it's hair's but I can't do it. What are we doing?
So why did you decide to embrace the curls?
Because I tried to have cool K-pop post-emo hair for, you know, it's 7 years. It never ever worked. Like maybe in like 5 photos in a decade, my hair looked good. The rest of the time I just looked like a rat.
Right.
That had sex with a mop.
Well, now I'm the only YouTuber with the emo hair.
You've left me
alone.
Me, Anthony,
Yeah.
Joey Graceffa.
They all left me behind.
So many people were doing the whole thing, and then one by one, you've just been abandoned.
Well, I thought today I could try out the curly hair lifestyle
by revealing his real hair. No.
So the first thing is when I was in my northern childhood,
Yeah.
my mum would say, "Eat the crusts on your toast.
It'll make your
It'll
hair
make
go
your hair go curly."
Except no one thought curly hair was cool in the 90s.
No, so they're like,
it
avoid
was
the
like,
crusts.
Excuse me, lady, chuck those things out.
Does everyone call it a crust? The edge around some bread.
What else would you call it?
I don't know, bread edge.
The bread edge.
The bredge. So I thought we could eat 400 crusts and see if my hair goes curly in a science experiment. But I thought that might take too long, so I bought...
I really thought that was the video idea for a second.
I bought some hair curlers.
Really?
Yes.
Really? That's what
So I thought you could curl my hair because you are the king of the hair curls.
Okay, firstly, as someone who spent hours every single day trying desperately to not have curly hair, I'm like offended that you're whacking out some curling hair.
I just thought it could happen.
Secondly, have you not seen hair curling videos on YouTube?
Yes, I have seen those
The
videos.
only time I've ever seen a video of hair curling is when a girl literally rips out her own fringe with a pair of and you want me to do. You just admitted that your power is in your fringe. And
I know.
What happened if I balded you right
Dan,
now?
these were on sale.
Okay, well that looks like an instrument of torture.
I don't know how to use this.
That looks like something else.
Ooh.
Chopsticks, you perv.
Hey, I can't use chopsticks. I could take these to the Japanese restaurant.
Please put these down.
Let's learn about hair curlers before you.
Well, I
put them
turn
in
them
my
on
head.
and then, you know, just freaking go to town.
Warning, do not use this on YouTube for entertainment.
Phil, I think I'm gonna murder you. So you're supposed to get a hair, wrap it round that.
Like a pigtail.
But then don't leave it closed for 30 seconds and pull, because that's when I rip your skull off.
It says 5 to 8 seconds.
The other concern is that this whole thing is like boiling hot, right? Like
I'm scared of it already.
Like, burn you,
Dan,
your skin will fall off.
Please be careful.
You have a very short, like right now, if I was to get a sample.
Okay, let's practice with it off. You touch my head.
Your hair's too short!
You touch my head with it. My scalp's going to be bleeding everywhere by the end of this video.
Your hair's too short to curl.
It's not. It's possible. Yours is curly. Do you think it's going to suit me? Like,
no.
No?
No, but they're on.
Oh my god, how do you tell if they're ready or not? Dan, don't mess about with it.
I'm not! This is incredibly... And I appreciate that I could disfigure you right now.
Transform me... No.
What was the last time I was on this bed? Abuse?
Banana abuse! Abuse!
We're about to have some curloose right now.
Oh, it smells like burning plastic. That's not good.
I think she's ready.
Alright, curl me up, best. So what celebrity do you think you're going to make me look like?
I'm going to go for teen Nick Jonas, but without the face, obviously.
What do you mean without the face?
Cause I'm going to burn your face off.
Right, just do it.
Okay.
Just rip the plaster off.
I'm going to start...
That's like the best bit of my hair. Don't start there.
I'm gonna,
like on the side.
Do you not want me to start with the safest, least likely to permanently disfigure you?
Okay.
Let's go for this.
I can't see.
Okay.
I can't breathe.
You don't need to see or breathe where you're going.
Ah! Please don't touch my head with it. Oh.
Okay.
Count. Which?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Release.
Okay.
We have a curl!
We have a wave!
Yeah! I think it could be more tightly curled though.
Oh, for God's sake, I'm trying not to maim you.
I want like Dan curls.
I am so freaking terrified, Phil.
Careful,
you
be
don't
careful.
understand.
Don't lean it on my head.
I've got a whole clump.
Okay.
It's undignified.
I'm scared. Oh, it's getting hot.
1, 2,
No, you've had.
3.
Ow! Son!
You can't do that!
I felt it burning! Ooh! Look at that!
Why do you still cling on to this emo thing when it died so long ago?
I think the fringe is part of my personality now.
Yes.
I've had it for so long, it's just who I am, so to get rid of it would just be too much of a big
To
deal.
erase your personality.
Yeah. Imagine you're gripping the tail of a tiny piglet.
Okay. Squee! I'm gonna pork you up, Phil.
No. My life is flashing before my eyes.
Wow, was it really boring?
Hey!
Ooh,
no.
singy-ling.
I'm having a great time. What would you call your salon?
Welcome to D's.
Welcome to D's.
D's H, which isn't Dan Howell, it's Dan's hair.
I'd call mine Lesty's Clippers.
Yeah, I'd avoid the shit out of that if I was
good.
walking down the street. Right, Phil, give me the top of your head.
Okay.
I'm going in close to your brain.
Please
If
don't.
I slip, I'll gouge these straight into your cerebral cortex.
I'm finding you so disturbing right now.
I mean,
what is
we're
this?
curling your hair, it's really fun. I'm just thinking about how this would be such an easy torture device. Like, you could really...
You could go to
You
town
could
on
make
that.
someone, like, do what...
Ow! 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 Just like that! That got me right on the scalp.
Stop being such a chicken. No offense to chickens. Are chickens afraid?
I
Like,
think-
why is it, like, problematic to chickens?
I don't know. I think there's some confident chickens out there.
I've
that,
been chased by some
dude.
chickens before.
Yeah.
I mean, that's maybe more about how unintimidating I am
It
rather
should
than
be-
the confidence of the chickens. I don't know, but...
Don't be such a guinea pig, because they're pretty scared of
Guinea
everything.
pigs are
They're
pretty
just like,
scared. Yeah, they're like... We need a safety word, Phil. Like, what
The safety word is ow.
The
as
safety
in,
word
like,
is...
stop.
Ah! You're burning my scalp!
Yeah.
Please help!
That was a bad one.
Get over it.
Are you almost done?
I'm doing the last bit
The
now.
last curl.
Are you ready for this? Phil's
haven't seen it.
Phil's gonna tilt up his head now. It's gonna be
Okay,
a drastic
here we go.
transformation. Okay, wait. 3, 2, 1.
Da 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 da!
Look at yourself. What do you think?
Wow! That actually suits me more than I thought it would.
We have basically like the same head now.
Oh my gosh.
We have the same haircut.
It's
and
so
This was
voluminous.
the only thing that was separating us.
Yeah.
It is voluminous.
It is.
You look like a cool Australian
A
surfer.
cool Australian surfer?
Yeah, like a weird goth one that has never been to the beach.
G'day, my name's Jimbo, and
I am like to
I like
post on MySpace.
staying inside.
Marilyn Manson. Yeah, that's what you look
So
like.
what name would you give me if you didn't know me and you met me in the street?
Patrick.
Patrick. I quite like
You
that.
look like such
Hey,
a Patrick
My
right
name's
now.
Patrick, and I spend about 7 hours curling my hair every morning. I feel like I should go take some cool Instagram photos now and be like,
Yeah, be like, what's
soft
up?
curls.
It's Patrick right now.
Yeah.
I'm V soft. But you feel like you need the edge of your straight black emo
Yeah, I
hair
do,
to
I do.
convey your person. How do you feel right now? Do you feel like
I feel like I'm not me.
Do you feel like a bit of a normie?
I feel like I want to pull my hair out. It doesn't look like me anymore.
In-depth cam.
Oh, here
There
we
we
go.
go. Ooh, look at those
Look at
curls.
these curls.
Oh yes,
Could
wow.
you
look
ride
at
any
that.
of them like a
You
wave?
could surf the frick out of that.
Can we edit on a surfer going through my hair?
There you go.
I
I know that I could have done a better job. What do you want from me?
I think you did well.
Did you want banter and comparison, or did you want good styling? Because
Hey.
you can only have one.
You didn't burn my face off.
I didn't burn
So
your face.
thank you. Good friend award.
That is a success.
Bink.
Thought that was going to be a high five.
That's what you need, the bit hanging
That,
down.
that one single, the Zane
Yeah.
curl.
No, I got the Zane curl. You need a Zane curl. Wait.
That's
There you
okay.
go.
That's not quite the same thing.
I think it
that's
was good.
that's a metaphor for my life. Comparing that to the Zane curl.
So in conclusion, I think I'm not going to keep this hair.
You're not going to spend half an hour
Yeah.
deliberately curling your hair
But
every
hey,
day?
if I ever go to
Are you saying that my head is ugly?
No, but if I ever go to some kind of fancy party,
Because yeah,
I could curl
you
the
go
hair.
you go to so many parties. Never mind fancy parties.
Okay.
That's a promise that he will never do this ever again.
I'm just gonna sit in a suit and eat popcorn by myself.
After curling your hair for half an hour. That sounds more
That's what I'll
relatable.
do. So give me a curly thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much to the original curly man, Dan.
Thank you very much.
For being in this video.
Yes.
For my transformation.
Click on me out of sympathy for my hair.
You can also check out my last video where I collaborated with Tinder.
Oh
so
god, the
if
cringe.
you're looking to find someone, you can download Tinder. The link is in the description. You can subscribe to Dan, click on his bubble, click on my bubble. Have a nice day.
Don't use curling irons if you don't know what you're doing.
You'll burn your face off.
But I didn't burn off Phil's.
I'm gonna end this with a curl. Goodbye.